This is Insight. Phone lines are open. Dial 384-2191.
We are live here on AM 1450 WDLB this Friday the 15th. I say that, you know it if you're listening to the radio, but you may be watching us on video here with Marshfield Media Access on their Facebook page. You may be watching us scattered throughout the month here, Channel 989 on your Spectrum Digital tier as they replay the program from time to time. Because in studio with me now, the third Friday of the month, I have Wood County Board Chairman, and this time, for the first time, I think you've been in the chair here, Lance Pliml. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I think it's the first time I've been in the chair, at least in this studio. So I appreciate the opportunity and always glad to help out when we can.
Now, for those of us in the county, we've heard your name before. This is not your first time as board chairman. Tell me about your, how would I say, career or stint with the board itself.
Sure, yeah, it's not my first rodeo. I've been on the board since the mid-'90s. I think I'm in about my 12th term. I'm a, I think, 7-time board chairman. So I've sat in this seat several times, although not in your studio, but in this chair, so fairly experienced in that capacity. And then I've also served as the president and chairman of the board of the Wisconsin Counties Association at the state level for a number of years. So I think I bring a county perspective, and then I also bring the perspective of all 72 counties whom I have had the opportunity to represent. So it's been long, it's been fun, and you know, sometimes it's hard to believe it's been however many years that is, 24 years or something in that respect. It seems like 2 at times.
Well, you must have been doing a admirable job. The board, that has changed from time to time as you look around the room, but they've brought you back again here. And sometimes, you know, I've served on boards and things, and we talk about being in clubs. Don't miss a meeting, you'll be president. It's not always something you aspire to. It's like, I don't want to do it. Everybody else just takes a step back and you're going, what happened? But
yeah, I think that's, you know, sometimes that is the way it plays out. But I think over time, you know, sometimes people think that you build a base and you build power, and all you really do is build maybe a little bit of respect and influence over time, and then you tend to get recruited, whether it's fraternal organization, a social organization, or it's government. And when you've done something long enough and you've tended to fulfill the responsibilities and do it well, you get asked back. So I was extremely, pat yourself on the back, but extremely proud of the fact that I think I was the first board chair since 1856 to ever serve even 2 consecutive terms, and I was lucky enough to serve 6 and now a 7th. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, the cynic's way of saying it is that's what you get for showing up for the meetings.
Yeah, and going back, we talked about that the other day when I first ran for the board. And I was a small business person who was basically recruited by the business community down in the Wisconsin Rapids area to run for the board to try to bring that perspective at a time when we didn't have a lot of that. And my take at the time was, yeah, I guess I could do 2 to 4 years and I'm out of here. And then you get involved. The community start to rely on you. You realize that you probably are more well-versed in some of those issues, and you keep getting recruited. And like I said, almost a quarter of a century later, you sit in the same chair. So it's been interesting. It's been fun. It's never been boring. And when that happens, or when you become complacent, then it's time to walk away.
Talking with Wood County Board Chairman Lance Pliml on today's Insight program here, this third Friday in the month of May. You brought it up, business. There's that, I don't want to call it a fight, but there's that idea between, you have to run it like a business. And government isn't a profitable business. There are taxpayers like myself who go, well, we're not just a bottomless well, whether it's federal, state, or county or city or wherever it is. But on the other hand, if it were profitable, it would probably be privatized. So we're set up to do that. How do you, conceal that in your own mind or reconcile that?
You do the best you can. Private industry tends to move much quicker than government, and sometimes things get done more expeditiously and sometimes maybe more cost effective. But there are certain functions that need to remain under the purview of government. It'd be pretty hard to privatize our sheriff's department, for instance, or some of the services that we provide. But at the end of the day, we don't make widgets. I can't have the manufacturing line go any quicker. I can't produce any more dollars than we have through tax revenue. And I'm one of those who fully understands the burden on the taxpayer, which is pretty phenomenal when you look at the slice of your income that is taken between state and local income taxes, property taxes, you name all the other ways that part of your income is eroded. And you have to balance that. And then you balance that with the needs of the people. So, one eye on that all the time, the other eye on those services in which we are required to provide. And there are no easy answers. I mean, I'd be lying if I said to you every night I go to bed and I sleep really well. There's some days where those decisions become very tough. And, do I give money to, when I say I, let me rephrase that, we as a board, do we allocate money to a wounded veteran, or do we allocate it to a child who's born with, physical or mental challenges, or some of those others? And there's never enough, but you have to make it work. And that's why I think we need to completely restructure the way we tax in the state of Wisconsin, the way we derive revenue. Society has changed. The way we do business has changed. Brick and mortar has turned into a digital world. So we're going to have to look at different ways to raise revenue to run government, and property tax is one of those. That's one of the most regressive taxes, and we're going to have to shift that to a different way of doing business.
Talking with Lance Pliml, Wood County Board Chairman. You can too, live on WDLB 384-2191, 384-2192. We'll get you into the studio here. But business, I think when people say run it like a business when they're talking about government, it's all you can do is be fiscally responsible and try not to waste. Now, the bigger the government gets, from county on up to federal, the more fingers in the pie, the more chances there are for bilking and money to be shifted and hidden here and there, and people taking advantage of things that they aren't able to or shouldn't be, or whatever the case. But I think that's about all you can do. And I'll give you the example of tools. See, when you buy something for the county, it's got to last. So you buy the best. And I'm looking at a taxpayer going, all I can afford is Black & Decker. You're buying Milwaukee, tools here. But that's because it's got to last. You buy the best because you want to get the most value out of what it is, not necessarily buy on the cheap all the time.
Yeah, cheapest first isn't always the lowest cost over time. And the point you made is a great point. The further you get from your local representative, local government is more effective than state government, more cost effective, which is more cost effective than federal government. And the more hands you have in that mix, the more the money gets diluted. And, and that's one of the things that we struggle with every day. I have the opportunity, as I mentioned, in a capacity as the president of the Counties Association, to deal with all 72 counties, to deal with our state and federal representatives when I'm out in Washington. And one of the things I think has been extremely ironic right now is, and I don't care who is in power, I will not make this a partisan issue, but I hear governors, both sides of the aisle, say the federal government has to stay out of this decision until they have a problem, and then they want the federal government to solve the problem. And it's just funny to hear that, because one day federal government has nothing to say about what I do. Oh, where is the federal government to bail me out? You need those levels of government. There are some things they provide, defense of our country, for instance, interstate travel, interstate commerce. But generally speaking, if we can keep those decisions local, we tend to use money better than they do from a federal perspective. And you at home probably use money more effectively than we do, as a government. Although I try to take every single decision, take it to the lowest common denominator and say, would I do this in my own household? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably a pretty sound decision.
He's Wood County Board Chairman Lance Pliml. When I sat in this chair and doing this Inside program, I learned over the years that it's all trickled down. And I don't mean economics, I mean tax money. That grants, ability to do business, your budgets are set up by what you're getting from the higher, whether it goes federal, state, then county. So your budgets are set on what you think they're going to be able to grant to you. To me, it's a check. I just want it to do what it needs to do. But you're living under a hierarchy here of federal flow down, and I think that's why when governors will stay out of my decision, but that's where the money's coming from.
Yeah, people who sit in your chair tend to, you hear a lot of this information. You probably know more than the general public on almost every issue, and probably more than most of us who sit in these chairs, because you hear it at every level. But that's absolutely spot on. We have these are round numbers, but we have a county budget in the neighborhood of $110 million, give or take, and about 80% of that is already mandated to which direction it goes because it's pass-through dollars from federal and state to run programs such as Medicaid, Medicare, those types of things. So of that total big $110 million budget, when I say it's a fairly big number, but only about 20 million of that is allocated to local programs and things we can do within the community, whether that be highways, parks, local programs that we need to administer. So we are an administrative arm of state government at the county level. And the fact of the matter is it gets pretty tough when they promise you dollars and then they don't show up. So, my big concern as we work through this COVID-19 pandemic is those revenues aren't just shrinking at the local level, they're shrinking at the state and federal level. And then as they continue to print money in Washington, I'm not exactly sure how we get through this. And anybody who tells you they know for sure is lying to you because we don't. We are in uncharted waters right now.
Well, we're giving money back to the people, and that's just fine and dandy, but it's money we don't have.
We're printing it every day. We don't have a penny of it. That's the interesting part.
Because we're deficit spending. If you did that on the county level, they'd be dragging you around behind the snowplow.
And if I did it on the personal level, I'd probably be sitting in jail somewhere. Have everything taken away.
We can't bounce checks like everybody else does.
Yeah, and that's the concern. It sounds great, and I understand everybody, is trying to do the best thing they can for the citizens they represent. But at the end of the day, we don't have $4 trillion. It wasn't sitting in a bank somewhere. So to give somebody something, you have to take something away from somebody else. Except we're not. We're just printing it. So, you've heard recently grocery prices rose the most, I think they said, in 41 years in the last month. I think you're going to see more of that. Inflation's going to follow the printing of more dollars. So I'm not sure where we're going to go, how we're going to handle it, but I can tell you from a county's perspective, we're looking at this every day and trying to stay on top of it, trying to, rein in some spending where at all possible, although, like I said, 80% of it's mandated already, but with a look to the future and how we move forward.
See, you have a little more of a catbird seat here in understanding how deficit spending leads to our groceries going up. It's not that it's that the dollar is worth less when they print more of them. So now they're charging more for these things because it's a cycle that doesn't appear right on the surface, but you understand how that can come back to price increase is really deficit spending.
Absolutely, and you're going to see that inflation, and you see that not only in groceries, you see that in housing and everywhere else. And there's no magic bullet to solve it. Like I said, everybody wants to do something for those constituents. Everybody wants to help the person who can't pay rent this month or they're having a problem with their mortgage payments. Those are all difficult things and difficult decisions. And, that's why I'm a firm believer in that personal responsibility. And it always amazes me when I'll try to separate my personal opinion from county opinion, but it always amazes me when I have somebody tell me they're having a difficult time paying, bill A, B, C, or D, and I watch them walking around with a $1,000 cell phone, and they tell me they're having trouble making their, monthly payment to the health club, cable TV, all those things that you would consider, extras in most places. We consider them a necessity, and they haven't saved, and then we end up with these problems. And then when you look at it in that grander perspective, you go, but what's the alternative? And the alternative sometimes may be to allocate those dollars, to print that money, is to have those people living on the street. So, we've been pretty lucky in central Wisconsin. We have a pretty conservative society. That's the reason you have people flocking out of some of those states and into others that have a less onerous tax situation. And we're seeing people right now locate out of the cities, Milwaukee, Madison, and some of the larger ones into rural Wisconsin right now. The amount of land getting sold up here with people thinking about building has been phenomenal over the last month.
Talking with Wood County Board Chairman Lance Pliml here on today's Inside program on WDLB this third Friday in the month of May. You've taken this in a direction that I find is where the rubber meets the road. When you talk about giving assistance, and I can use it as an individual or we can use it as pots of assistance for groups or whatever across the county. Once you give someone something, is it yours to say what's done with it? You talk about cell phones and how they spend it. If I give people assistance, do I have the right to tell them how to spend the money? if you live and think of it as your own, if you give money to your kids and you help them out, as we call it, we were helping them out. They're a little short this month. Do you have the right to tell them no cigarettes and beer? Do you have the right to tell them this is for diapers and formula? Or, this is where we get into a big political discussion.
Yeah, I have the right, but they don't have to listen, I guess. That's
But
that's
do
one of the
you?
things.
You're a government entity.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that you try to balance every day. Once the dollars leave our hands, there are some restrictions in how they have to be spent. One of the think of your food assistance program, SNAP, which used to be food stamps. I mean, you're somewhat limited to what you can buy. So there's strings attached to the money oftentimes. But frankly, not all of it. And when some of it leaves, it's hard to dictate where it goes. And, every one of us in society, you tend to see the abuses. Those stand out, they resonate with you. I'm going to say the vast majority probably don't abuse, but the ones that do, like I said, you see those in the stores, you see it in other places, you see it in society. And the tough part is, the hardworking taxpayer out there in Marshfield or around the county, watches a large part of their income go to fund these programs, and they don't like to see those abuses. You worked hard for it, and frankly, prior to this pandemic, we were in a situation where we had anybody who wanted a job could get a job. And I'm kind of a pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of guy, and go out there and make a living, contribute to society. Saying that, I fully understand that there are people with different challenges who, life is, provided setbacks, whether it be health or others, maybe an accident somewhere that need help. That is not the largest part of the population, and governments need to be aware of that. To your point, we just cannot keep printing money. You can't. There's a limit to how much can be spent on that without putting everybody else who is working, into a terrible situation.
Well, and keeping it on, instead of a personal point here, we're keeping it on a governmental point. The county funds a home that is for elderly, or Norwood, or places like that. Now, you go tell them that they're not worth your efforts, or that the money that you may or may not have. I mean, you can show them the checkbook and say, I don't have it. But like you said, what's the alternative? Turning people loose on the street? I mean, we're getting close now. We're just at the tip of the iceberg here of what was once the Great Depression. I mean, we're at that have not been seen in a lot of our lifetimes. This is just beginning. So how government is going to handle this, and how you're going to be put into a position here of unenviable decisions. If you were before, it's going to really ratchet up now, because we have to keep certain things. I'm saying it, I have to, really? Other people say, no, we don't. And you have discussions like that at board. This supervisor says, no, we don't. That supervisor says, well, we can't not fund that. Everybody, well, that's your cause. No, that's not a cause. That's humanity. You're put in a position where, how? There just isn't enough money to go around.
Yeah, there's never enough to go around. This is a conversation that I have, with my father fairly often, and my dad's about 88 years old right now. And, everything we do in government to some extent is a compromise. If I don't do this, then what? That's the question you always ask yourself every single time. You say, what's the least objectionable action that you might take? And that's a really good example. Do you incarcerate? Don't you incarcerate? Do you provide housing? Don't you? Do you provide food and shelter and all those other things that would be considered necessities of life? And at what level do you provide that? Sometimes I will make a point using, going to the ridiculous to make the point, but, we want nobody starving on the streets, but I don't think that anybody expects anybody we're providing aid to be necessarily, crab legs and lobster. So you try to have some strings attached to those dollars that get allocated to those in need. But again, it's a series of compromises, and you say, what's best at the end of the day? How do we make society safe? And when we poll the people in the community, say, what's the number one issue for you? Generally speaking, public safety rises to the top. I want to know that when I leave my house, I'm safe. I'm not going to get mugged. I'm not going to get robbed, that I'm safe within my house. Then we start breaking it down to things further down the list. and eventually we get to those others. And as we allocate dollars at the county level, we try to allocate the most dollars in those areas where we meet the needs generally portrayed to us by the taxpayer through these types of conversations. So most of my day is spent answering the phone. The other day when the governor's order was vacated by the Supreme Court, I think that order came down at 5:05 or 5:06. From 5:07 to 11 o'clock that night, I never hung up the phone. It was just switched from one call to another. Where are we? What do we do? How do we do it? And that's the balance with business right now and safety. Where do we provide a level of safety within the community, and how do we allow businesses to not only survive but hopefully thrive? How do we employ people? So everything, all of those are compromised decisions. You only hope you make the right one. And the last thing I'd add to that is, if you're doing neurosurgery, if I'm sitting up here in the Marshfield Clinic and I'm a neurosurgeon and I make a mistake and say, oops, it's probably a really big problem. The one thing that I hope all the government officials that are either listening or that work with me on the board realize, if we make a bad decision, we typically have the ability to right that pretty quickly. And so I always tell people, have enough flexibility, have those thoughts be fluid and be able to adjust when necessary.
Talking with Wood County Board Chairman Lance Pliml. You can too, 384-2192, 384-2191. Here, we'll get you into the studio. And our initial visit with him, first time that I've had the opportunity here in the WDLB studios to visit with him. So take that opportunity. Giving, and there's the wrong word again, allocating, because people say, well, I don't have to give you anything. Well, that's maybe true. But allocating money to certain areas, the ability to tell people how it's going to be used is one of those things that is very difficult, because there are certain members, even on the supervisors, a board member would like this to happen or that to happen. Unintended consequence. Oh my God. The world is full of it. They had their heart in the right place, but it just didn't happen that way because people just seem to, humans have the ability to abuse, not necessarily good nature, but programs and things that will take it. If there wasn't for that, and I'm talking to the listeners here, if everybody would just play it by the rules, we wouldn't have this situation. But here we are, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things in it, every time you either attend a presentation somewhere around the country, or you're listening to shows like this, typically I tend to pick up a nugget here or there that you use oftentimes. But one of the things I've often said in government, it isn't as if you pull on one end of the string and the other end comes along. It's more as if you disturb a spider web and you pull on one little thread, and pretty soon the entire web is moving in different directions. And that is typically the unintended consequence of the decision that we make. So, we're constantly, you're trying to anticipate what that unintended consequence will be. But if you pull funding in one area and you allocate it somewhere else, there's obviously going to be repercussions. And you try to do that to minimize those. But at the end of the day, it happens. If you pull $1 million out of a program in one place and allocate it somewhere else, there's a shortfall there. And so sometimes you try to, garner those dollars from numerous sources, make the impact less to any particular program as you see a need somewhere else. And again, it's make your community safer. In a perfect world, everybody's working, everybody's financially stable, and everybody can take care of themselves. But that's not the reality. We look at things like we went from a situation years ago where we tended to have more institutional settings for the care of elderly or those who were challenged. And then we moved those out into, community-based residential facilities. And then all of a sudden you go, well, the transportation and the care and the ability to have enough people in all those places becomes difficult. It's financially challenging, and it's just difficult to get the number of people to do that, especially when we have a demographic shift on a geographic level where people are moving to bigger cities and small towns are tending to decline in population. Well, maybe you need to reevaluate it sometimes. Say it's very difficult to provide transportation, to provide housing, to provide those aids to people that are in extreme outlying areas. And then you balance that with, but how do we keep those communities alive, and how do we have them thrive? And those are I never have a problem going to sleep totally, but those are the nights where you get a little less sleep, as you think about that during the evening and say, what am I going to say in the morning? What am I going to do?
Well, private business is meant to operate at a profit or they won't be in business. Government was conceived to operate at a loss. I mean, but how that money is allocated is where all the argument comes in. Who's going to get what and which is more important than the other? And, when you're the one who's not got lunch today, my wife had lung cancer, and the old saying was, when you can't breathe, nothing else matters. So when it's yours in your backyard, you begin to become a little, they call it selfish. Well, selfish means survival, as I know it. So it's tough.
No, and it, like I said, oftentimes you try to, as somebody who sits in my chair, you try to always, like I said, break it down, think what would you do at home? And sometimes somebody says to you, why are you spending the amount of money you're spending, for instance, improving the roadway or patching holes if it's a village or municipality on a city street or a county highway for that matter. And when you look at the increase in your property tax rate, which may cost across the board, that increase could be as high as $100 a year, let's say. But when I'm driving down, I don't want to use Central Avenue because that one's brand new and in pretty good shape. But if I'm driving down the road and I hit a big pothole and I bend the rim on my car, or I have a ball joint fail, or I do something to the suspension, the repair is much greater than the cost to me to have fixed that road. So, that's a pretty simple example, but that's what we look at every day. What will that cost be to the individual taxpayer? What's the benefit to him, both individually and societally? And those are tough decisions. Some days you don't want to get up and deal with them, but you have to. You alluded to health challenges within your own family, and my family's gone through that too. And you deal with the immediate need first, and that's what government does. Every morning we wake up with a plan. We say, this is our plan for the day. This is where we're going. This is our capital improvement projects that we've planned for the next year. And then something hits like we have right now. And it's unanticipated. We don't know exactly how we're going to handle it. So all those plans tend to go out the window. So it starts with, here's the plan. There's an emergency today. We need to deal with that first. We have to take care of, the nuts and bolts before we get back to what we're doing. And, I think that's going to be the biggest challenge going forward this year is we deal with an ever-changing world right now. We're going to have to, constantly change the way we're doing things and adapt. The thing that drives me a little bit crazy is when I hear people say it will never go back to normal. Well, I'm a big fan of the History Channel. I watch that almost constantly. And if you look back, when I hear people say it'll never be as bad as it is now, I'm going, do you ever watch what these people dealt with who fought in World War I? And as the country ramped up to prepare for that and to provide, or World War II, or some of the illnesses, pandemics, even go back to, polio, back 50s, 60s. I mean, we will recover. It will go back to normal. That perspective is so short. When you hear people say, and by the way, this is not a knock on any Green Bay quarterback. When I hear people say, Aaron Rodgers is the greatest quarterback the Packers ever had, well, some of those people never saw Brett Favre play, and more than that, never saw Bart Starr play. And I'm saying, it's easy to think that what we're dealing with right now is the worst, or it's never happened before. It has. We will recover. We're going to come back to a time where people are going to be shaking hands. You're going to be able to, hug your friends and neighbors. We will get through this. It's just, kind of trying to figure out exactly how we're going to get there and how quickly that's going to happen.
Well, to use your Packer quarterback analogy here, they were apples and oranges. Bart Starr called his own plays. To say one's greater than the other is putting under different scope here, under different lenses on what they were expected to do in their time and place. We'll talk more about that, and you can too, with Wood County Board Chairman Lance Pliml availing himself to us here on the third Friday of the month on AM 1450 WDLB's Inside program live, or you may be watching us on video, Marshfield Media Access, or in rewatch on Spectrum Channel 989. We'll talk more coming up.
This week is National Police Week, when we honor the service and sacrifice of the officers that keep us safe. This year is unlike any other that we've experienced before. Hi, I'm Jim Palmer from the Wisconsin Professional Police Association. On behalf of our law enforcement community, we would like to thank you for the overwhelming support that you have shown to our officers during the current health crisis. We also want to recognize you and your efforts. Our ability to the pandemic depends upon the collective actions and sacrifices of many people. There are those of you that are still doing things like delivering the mail, stocking our grocery stores, and educating our children. We also know that many of you are unable to work, and we recognize your absence more each day. As we honor our nation's officers during this Police Week, let us also acknowledge how each of us is on the front line of the current health crisis and recognize that bravery comes in many forms. For more, go to WPPA.com.
AM 1450 WDLB's Insight program here for the third Friday in the month of May. You know that if you're listening live. You could be watching us in video, though, in the future. And I always say, you know how things turned out. We're talking about things right now that haven't happened yet. So it's like that TV show where you get the newspaper from tomorrow. You already know. We, on the other hand, don't know how a lot of these things came out. So the discussion that we have here on radio is have to be looked at through the lens of the present time. And things change. You hear this in the media for sure, but our business is gathering information that's coming at a rate that we haven't had for quite some time. That whether it's a war or whatever, and part of it is the technology. I know things now. I think about Walter Cronkite when he was reporting from Vietnam, and people were just amazed at how fast we could get the information. Yeah, at 5:30 once a day. Now it's where it is as it's happening. We're watching live news conferences and disasters, of whether it's fires or hurricanes, as they're happening at a rate we're taking in the information. And I don't know as humans yet we've been able to digest all of that and what our brains are able to wrap around at the speed at which it's brought to us. And now we're in a situation where you mentioned before the Supreme Court decision that came down in Wisconsin, and it caught everybody flat-footed. I'm like, what? I mean, you have to don't you have to have some, whether you're a business or a government agency, some contingency plans? What if they rule this way? What if they rule that way?
We're looking at it every day. I'm amazed, too, when I hear people say we were caught off guard. We didn't know this was coming. We knew a ruling was coming. I actually assumed it was coming last week, Friday. I assumed they were going to drop it on at 5 o'clock, so nobody had to answer any questions.
The only part about that was they thought there would be a stay for some period of time as normalcy and give you a chance to get your bearings.
Yeah, again, that's the expect the unexpected, the unanticipated. Again, I think a lot of people thought that may have been an overreach. You should have been preparing. I know yesterday you had our public health officer on, Sue Comferman, Donna Rosar were up here. Those two people are extremely well versed, in the health aspect of all of this. We have businesses that at 5:07 the other day threw the doors open and said, come on in, you're welcome. And then we had other businesses that took I'll call it a much smarter approach and said, we knew this was coming. For 2 weeks we talked about how we were going to, and I almost hate using the phrase, it's getting so overused, how to social distance, how to sanitize, how to cleanse, how we're going to conscientiously and safely serve the public while still being able to make a living. Those are the ones you tend to admire. And the point you made before, and I think it's a really great point, you're never going to get everybody to comply. The speed limit, generally speaking, out there on 55 miles an hour. Some people drive 56, some drive 60. And now people come and go, why bother have a speed limit? Because 95% of the people go the speed limit. Most of the people are going to abide by what had been the guidelines that had been provided by WEDC and some of the others as to, those social distancing guidelines, use of sanitizer, don't go out if you're sick, self-monitor, be a responsible citizen. We're extremely lucky to have unbelievable health providers here, especially up here in Marshfield. I mean, the Marshfield Clinic is nationally renowned, if not world renowned. I can't tell you how lucky we are to have those people up here at that clinic and the service they provide. And there's more than just them in the county. You know, we have Aspirus, Ascension. I'm gonna leave out a whole bunch of others, but we're extremely lucky here. The other part where we're really lucky is to have local media like you sitting at this desk talking to us. One of the things that probably erodes the fabric of small town America faster than anything else is the loss of local radio stations and local newspapers, where you really get, you know, the local flair, the local flavor. You can disseminate the news that's important to this area fairly quickly. Now, I'm going to go back and regress here a little bit, but what was really interesting to me with the governor's order originally is that there was a statewide order. My personal opinion on this is what affected Milwaukee had not affected the northern half of the state at all. And to have closed the businesses in the northern part of the state for 8 weeks prior to, I'm going to call it, any spread of the infection seemed to me to be early. You know, we had the ability through local health departments and officials to make those changes when we needed to. And I'm going to use this example. Had Montana had a pandemic outbreak of COVID-19 and it was in Montana, do you think they would have shut Manhattan down? People in Manhattan don't even know where Montana is, if I generally ask them. It wouldn't have affected business at all. So, you know, as this infection spread, as the virus spread, you know, local health officials need to be on the ball. They need to be ready. We need to have capacity. And I certainly understand the flatten the curve. My wife works in the medical community, that we had to have capacity. But when we started to reach the point where we have our large medical providers laying people off, because there's nobody to see, you're going, there needs to be a balance we can strike there. And that's where, you know, local officials need to speak up. We need to stay in contact with those state officials. The state officials need to stay in contact with the federal officials. And this is a general statement, but things typically are best handled close to home. That doesn't mean you don't work in concert with those other organizations, but you know, those people at the Marshfield Clinic, while I'm sitting up here in Marshfield, have a lot better handle on what's going on in Marshfield than somebody does sitting in Washington, D.C.
Well, I'll expound on another avenue on your hypothesis here, and that is the old saying that maybe Northern and Southern didn't have a lot as a statewide order was to say, but, you know, I only peed in my end of the pool. At some point here, now that we've got this open, the people in the north that are going from Madison to Minocqua now, they're going from Chicago to their camp, you're going to find that that is going to be more of a situation that you opened it up. And I think they were trying to tamp that down as long as they could. The people up there said, well, we don't have any cases. That's because of, not in spite of.
Yeah, I mean, I am not a proponent of you should have just got in your car and driven wherever you wanted in the country. And I think that was part of the order. You know, no matter what they say, the safest place to be is quarantine in your house. No argument. You know, in your yard, probably still pretty safe. And if you lived up in Minocqua, and well, that's a pretty high tourist area, but you know, if I lived up north somewhere, and my community is somewhat, you know, separated from the rest of the state, I probably could have operated safely for a period of time had the people elsewhere stayed in the general area where they were supposed to stay. Now, I'm going to say in my own county, the other day I was at a convenience store, and I just happened to notice there were license plates while I was in the parking lot from Kentucky, Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin. That scared me because I know the rate of infection, for instance, in Chicago is much higher than it was in Wood County. So you're right. I mean, and it becomes a balance, and that's the decision. Are we going to be right every step of the way? Absolutely not. How do we balance those people that aren't going to eat, aren't going to pay their mortgages, aren't going to pay their bills with the risk to society? And that's where I really lean on those local officials through those medical providers to provide us the latest, greatest information, talk about capacity, and talk about how we treat. So, yeah, there isn't a right or wrong. It's maybe a better, best, and worse case scenario.
Well, this thing shows no boundaries. You know, we talk about how Hayward and Mercer had different in Milwaukee and Madison, but, you know, well, we don't need to stay home. Yeah, if you stay on your yard. You know, when we start, you can't put guards at the county border and say, you're not coming through here. That's where we wind up with problems, is that there's no...
Yeah, and borders are blurred. You know, especially in today, you know, as mobile as society is. The part of the order, I think, that drove a lot of the state nuts was, and this is, all of the big box stores were open. Walk in, get whatever you wanted. I mean, I understand that some of them have groceries, but they also sell jewelry and clothes and lawn equipment and everything else. And the person who owned Joe's shoe store, who maybe had 1 or 2 customers a day, couldn't allow them to walk in the door. And that's the balance, and that's where I'm hoping the legislature, along with the governor's administration, sit down and create some kind of common sense.
That seems
solution.
unfair to the owners, but it was simply a space issue. The social distancing. I can go in a big box store and not come within 6 feet of anybody. If I go to the shoe store downtown, there's no way that I can not come within 6 feet of somebody.
Well, yeah, there's something where I think with guidelines, you could have done that. I'm looking at when I walk in, and I'm not going to name them, but when I walk in those, people are passing me in the aisles. I'm giving people money. I'm getting change. I'm walking in and out. People are walking by me in the parking lot. You try to distance. Some of these small businesses, using some of those guidelines, I'm going to let 2 people or 3 people at a time in my store. I'm going to ask them to mask. We're gonna abide by those rules that were put in place, or the guidelines that were put in place. You probably could have maintained even a greater distance than we're seeing in some of the others. And that's where I say that's the personal responsibility part. The last thing I want to do is walk into a building and physically hurt somebody. Whether it's my parents, like, we just talked, my parents are alive at, 88, and my mom, happy birthday, Mom, if you're listening, will be 85 tomorrow. But that's my biggest fear. Who do I, if I'm asymptomatic or if I've just been infected and I'm still asymptomatic but infected, who might I transmit that to? That's a fear that we all have. But, how do you balance that with, you made the point for, we can't go on. I don't know what would happen if you closed businesses for another 2 or 3 months. Like you're saying, I'm guessing that Main Street in Wisconsin Rapids, in Marshfield, and in all the other small communities would be vacant. I mean, there would be nothing left there at the end of the day.
The smaller the business, the harder the hit, but also the smaller the area. And that's why I think when people try to compare the big box to the downtown shops, it's a tough thing, but there was a reason, a scientific reason for that, air movement and proximity and...
Yeah, you'd have to have the distancing. You'd have to limit the number of people in. You can't just open the door. But the big box stores were doing that too. They were counting people out. They have one-way aisles in a number of them. And I think the small business could have done that. Now, do I think that, again, personal opinion has nothing to do with ours. Do I think that, and in a full disclosure, most of the money I made in my life was in the bar and restaurant industry. Do I think that at 507, every bar should have just thrown the doors open and said, have at it with no precautions put in place? The answer is no. And I'm hoping those that decided to open did so as responsibly as possible. There is no perfect world, though. You're spot on, and I don't know how to balance that. Again, that's if all of a sudden I have an unemployment rate of 60%, the government doesn't have any money to offset that. There's no way to handle it.
Well,
so where do we go?
You're seeing on the state level now, though, that they're in the legislature trying to precurse litigation that's going to come their way. If that small business owner and its contact tracing can find that that's where it happened, now there's lawyers licking their chops here for people who can be held accountable for that.
Had a conversation yesterday with some of the top attorneys in the state. They said that in and of itself is highly unlikely to be something that anybody could be charged with or prosecuted or ever found guilty with unless you purposefully, went in, coughed, spit, did something to infect. In just the general everyday life, they said that would be generally an impossibility to find anybody liable at the end of the day. That doesn't preclude the fact there would be litigation, and at the end of the day, that takes time, costs money too.
But like the Wisconsin Restaurant Association and other people recommend maybe that you take temperatures. Put yourself in a position where if you do get a lawsuit, you said, look, I've done everything I can. You know, there was no malice on the part of the owner, obviously. You know, when even these guys that threw their taverns open and people came in, they're not trying to infect people. They're not releasing it in the air and telling people, well, come on in and get a snort of COVID. They're just, but on the other hand, you have to say, I'm doing everything I can to keep everybody safe, despite their even a lack of sanitization.
And that was the preparation that we spoke about earlier. You know, whether that happened, a day ago, 2 days ago, it was going to happen on the 26th, or it was going to happen in the middle of June sometime. Those preparations are what need to happen. And, although the order, was vacated and went away, the virus hasn't. And you're hoping that those business owners that were going to open put in place those precautions and took them. By the same token, any business owner that didn't feel compelled to open or safe, there was no order that forced them to open. But you're right. I mean, as you walk into the medical facilities, temperature, distance, looking for people who are symptomatic, asking people who come in to mask, having your employees mask. All of those things are much better solution than just throwing the doors open. And then, like I said, if a business isn't comfortable in opening, nobody said you need to. They're just saying those that, in some cases, just have to, or they're not going to exist next week. And many people have poured their life savings in that have the ability to. My hope in Wood County is you follow the highest level of guidelines available. And our county health officers put out a tremendous toolkit for you to work with.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Talking with Lance Pliml, Wood County Board Chairman here on the Insight program on WDLB. That is bringing it back to the county again. Are you or have you thought about what you're going to do as far as budgets for Wood County Health Department and what they are going to be responsible for and guidelines and how they're going to be able to implement that with your help?
We think about it every day. I mean, that's the kind of the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room right now. From a health perspective, and this isn't going to solve it at the national or state level, a lot of the dollars that are being used in that respect at our level are dollars that have been allocated by the state or federal government to deal with that specific issue. And they are dealing with, to some extent, cost involved with that. But what they don't provide for is lost revenue. So although we have a direct cost that may be, somewhat offset by other government dollars coming in, there's a lack of revenue that we're seeing across the county. And that revenue, a large part of that is sales tax. The online retailers are doing exceptionally well. The local guys on Main Street here in Marshfield, I'm guessing are hurting pretty significantly. I had a story relayed to me by somebody up here in Marshfield. One of the representatives said that they had spoken to a local accountant. The accountant said that roughly 20% of the businesses they represent were going to be gone as of about June 1st if they couldn't get the doors open. Now, I don't have a way to verify that, but just talking to people on the street and having been somebody who's been in business, most business people try to keep your people on the payroll. You try to make them whole. You do the best you can, but at the end of the day, your pockets are empty. Government, somewhat the same respect. We're going to have a huge sales tax hole to fill. I think the estimates right now, if I had to guess between sales tax and some of the other revenues decrease we've seen, is we're going to probably be filling between a $2.5 and a $3 million hole when we start this budget process. So it's going to be difficult. We've asked our department heads to kind of pitch in, take a look, If you start saving now, it's going to be a lot easier than if you try to put a Band-Aid on it in November. So, yeah, I mean, you provide so much insight into this because you hear it, you see it, you're out in the community, and you're fielding questions.
Everybody wants to tell you do more, or now it's just, can you please do the same with less? And I don't know how we can make that patch any tighter than what we can.
You can't. I mean, at some point, it's stretched to the limit, and you can't do more with less. I always laugh when somebody says, I'm working at 110% of capacity. No, you're not. You're working at 100% of capacity. If you're doing that, that's fantastic, and that's all you've got to give. And same thing with dollars. When we run out of dollars, there's nowhere else to go. So, you try to save as much as you can on the front end. You try to make sure that the revenue stream exists. But at the end of the day, there are no more. There's nowhere to go. The well is run dry, so to speak. And at that point, you can't do more. you probably can't do what you did, and that's when we start looking at capital improvement and starting to cut the number of road miles that will improve, or other improvements that we were looking at, whether it be within the facilities themselves or it be the programs. How do we provide the lowest level of benefit that were required by law instead of the middle or higher benefit that we may have provided in the past?
Well, you've got all kinds of things here in your budget, which is infrastructure is what you're talking about. Correct. Here. That's going to take a hit, and people are going to start to see that at the recession, depression type things. It's not now, but things aren't going to be fixed. Things are going to, I mean, are you going to defund the county home in Norwood, or are you going to run the snowplow on flat tires? I mean, which?
Those are the ones that keep me sleepless at night, and you go, what cut is going to have the least impact to safety? That kind of comes first, and then to the community as a whole. And you try to, like I said, you might try to save those dollars in a number of areas rather than in just one area, or you say, what can we put off till next year? But eventually, it can't be put off anymore, and it needs to be done. And that's when, you get screamed at when the taxes go up. But generally speaking, all of the levels of government, at least here in central Wisconsin, have been very responsible in tax rates.
Well, you're going to, and we talked about this earlier, how I've learned that most, I don't even know if I can use the word term most, but a good percentage of what you do fiscally is a roll down to you from higher
80% of it, yeah.
Well, there you go. It is most. It is 80% of what you do in your budget comes from other sources other than your taxable base.
With statutory requirements on how that gets spent. And then sometimes you say, well, we may be providing a slightly elevated, extra value to that program, but how do we trim that? How do we, maybe cut that to the bare bones, but we still have to provide service, correct?
Well, it's good to see you, and I look forward to our visits. We haven't even scratched the surface here. A lot of it is, of course, talking about pandemic issues as we have them here, dollar-wise, right in front of us, but we didn't talk anything about jail, about how we're going to keep it from getting around in the jail, what that means, how that money is going to be spent for incarceration. You used the word earlier in the program. We're looking at all those things, and we'll know more next month than we do this month, I guess, from day to day.
Yeah, I always appreciate the conversation. We could probably go 5 or 6 hours here, and look forward to next month.
Oof, I don't know if anybody could listen to that. All right, Lance Pliml, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wood County Board Chairman here on today's Inside program.
From the kennel to the coop, whatever the season, Fleet Farm has everything to keep your animals happy and healthy.